In a small hospital ward in East Grinstead, England, a young RAF pilot stares into a mirror for the first time in months. What he sees reflected back is barely recognizable as human. His face is now a patchwork of grafted skin and surgical scars. The Second World War didn't just reshape nations. It revolutionized an entire field of medicine. Plastic surgery was born from the desperate need to rebuild human faces and bodies, destroyed by the most devastating conflict in human history. This is the tragic history of World War II plastic surgery. When the Luftwaffe began its relentless bombing campaign over Britain in 1940, Royal Air Force pilots found themselves facing an enemy more terrifying than German fighters: fire. The Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane, Britain's frontline fighters, had a fatal design flaw. Their fuel tanks were positioned directly in front of the cockpit, and when enemy bullets pierced these tanks, aviation fuel would spray directly onto the pilot. At 20,000 feet, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, pilots flew without face masks or protective gear. When their aircraft caught fire, they had mere seconds to decide: bail out and face certain capture, or try to land the burning machine. Many chose to stay with their aircraft, and in those terrifying moments, aviation fuel would ignite, turning the cockpit into a furnace. Flight Lieutenant Richard Hillary was one such pilot. On September 3, 1940, his Spitfire was hit during a dogfight over the English Channel. As flames engulfed his cockpit, Hillary made the split-second decision to bail out, but it was too late. The fire had already done its work. His hands were burned down to the bone, his face was unrecognizable, and his eyelids were so severely damaged that he couldn't close his eyes. Hillary's injuries were catastrophic, but he was far from alone. By the end of 1940, hundreds of RAF aircrew were arriving at hospitals across Britain with similar devastating burns. These weren't just surface wounds. They were deep, third-degree burns that destroyed skin, muscle, and often bone itself. Traditional medicine had no answers for injuries this severe. The medical establishment was unprepared for the scale and severity of these injuries. Burns covering more than 30% of the body were considered fatal. Facial burns that destroyed the nose, lips, and eyelids were deemed untreatable. Hands burned down to exposed tendons were often amputated without question. The standard treatment was to apply tannic acid, cover the wounds, and hope for the best. But hope was in short supply. Patients who survived the initial trauma faced a lifetime of disability and disfigurement. Many couldn't eat properly because their mouths were too damaged. Others couldn't see because their eyelids no longer functioned. The psychological trauma was often worse than the physical injuries. These young men, many barely 20 years old, would never again look in a mirror without being reminded of that moment when their world caught fire. Yet from this tragedy, something extraordinary was about to emerge. In a small cottage hospital in East Grinstead, a New Zealand-born surgeon named Archibald McIndoe was preparing to challenge everything the medical world believed about treating severe burns. But McIndoe's revolutionary approach would soon reveal just how unprepared society was for the human cost of modern warfare. Archibald Hector McIndoe arrived at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead in 1939, just months before Britain declared war on Germany. At 40 years old, he was already an accomplished surgeon, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what was coming. The hospital itself was modest, a former tuberculosis sanatorium converted for wartime use, but it would soon become the epicenter of a medical revolution. When the first burned aircrew began arriving in late 1940, McIndoe was horrified by the standard treatment protocols. The established method involved applying tannic acid to burns, which created a hard, leather-like surface that doctors believed would protect the wound. But McIndoe observed something that others had missed. This treatment was actually making things worse. The tannic acid was preventing proper healing and trapping infection beneath the hardened surface. Against the explicit orders of his superiors, McIndoe began experimenting with a radical new approach. Instead of tannic acid, he used saline baths to keep wounds clean and moist. Rather than leaving patients immobilized in bed, he encouraged them to move around. Most controversially, he abandoned the traditional practice of keeping burn patients in sterile isolation, instead allowing them to interact with the local community. His first major case was a young hurricane pilot whose face had been completely destroyed in a crash landing. The man's nose was gone, his lips were burned away, and his eyelids were so damaged that his eyes were permanently exposed. Traditional medicine would have declared him untreatable, But McIndoe saw possibilities where others saw only hopelessness. The surgeon began what would become known as the total reconstruction approach. Using skin grafts taken from the patient's own body, usually from the thighs or buttocks where skin was plentiful, McIndoe began the painstaking process of rebuilding a human face. But this wasn't simply a matter of covering wounds with new skin. Each graft had to be carefully shaped and positioned to recreate the complex three-dimensional structure of facial features. The process was excruciating for patients. A single reconstruction might require 10, 15, or even 20 separate operations spread over months or years. Between surgeries, patients would wait weeks for their bodies to heal enough for the next procedure. Many operations failed completely. Grafts would die, become infected, or simply not take hold. When this happened, the entire process would begin again. McIndoe's approach was as much psychological as it was medical. He understood that these young men weren't just dealing with physical trauma, they were grappling with the complete destruction of their identity. He encouraged them to look in mirrors, even when their reflections were disturbing. He insisted they participate in social activities, despite their disfigurement. Most importantly, he treated them not as victims, but as heroes who deserve the very best care possible. The surgeon also recognized that traditional hospital discipline was counterproductive for his patients. These were combat veterans who had faced death in aerial combat. They didn't need to be treated like invalids. McIndoe allowed drinking, smoking, and even romantic relationships within the hospital. He encouraged patients to wear civilian clothes instead of hospital gowns, and to maintain as normal a social life as possible. This unconventional approach drew fierce criticism from the medical establishment. Senior colleagues accused McIndoe of running a country club rather than a hospital. Military authorities complained that he was undermining discipline and proper medical protocol, but the results spoke for themselves. Patients under McIndoe's care were not only surviving injuries that had previously been considered fatal, they were returning to active duty and leading productive lives. However, the true scope of McIndoe's challenge was only beginning to reveal itself as the war escalated and new types of injuries began arriving at his hospital. By 1941, the nature of aerial warfare had evolved dramatically. German anti-aircraft guns had become more accurate, and the Luftwaffe was deploying new types of incendiary ammunition specifically designed to ignite aircraft fuel. The result was a steady stream of severely burned aircrew arriving at East Grinstead, each case more challenging than the last. McIndoe's patients began calling themselves the Guinea Pig Club, a darkly humorous reference to the experimental nature of their treatment. These men understood that they were pioneers in uncharted medical territory, that every procedure performed on them was potentially breaking new ground. The club eventually grew to include 649 members, all aircrew who had undergone plastic surgery under McIndoe's care. One of the most remarkable cases was that of squadron leader Tom Gleave, whose Hurricane caught fire during the Battle of Britain. Gleave's injuries were so severe that when he was first brought to McIndoe, the surgeon could barely determine where his face had been. His nose was completely destroyed, his lips were burned away, and both hands were reduced to exposed bone and tendon. McIndoe began Gleave's reconstruction by first addressing the most critical issues, creating functional eyelids so he could close his eyes, and rebuilding enough of his mouth so he could eat and speak. The process would take over 2 years, and involved more than 30 separate operations. Each surgery was a delicate balance between function and appearance, between medical necessity and human dignity. The techniques McIndoe developed for cases like Gleave's were revolutionary. He pioneered the use of tubed pedicle grafts, sections of skin that remained attached to their original blood supply, while being gradually moved to a new location. This method dramatically improved the survival rate of large skin grafts and allowed for more complex reconstructions. For nasal reconstruction, McIndoe developed what became known as the forehead flap technique. He would create a flap of skin from the forehead, keeping it connected to maintain blood flow, then gradually rotate it down to form a new nose. The process took months, as the skin had to be slowly trained into its new position, but the results were remarkable. Functional noses that could breathe and even smell. Hand reconstruction presented unique challenges. Many patients arrived with fingers burned down to bare bone, or hands so contracted by scar tissue that they were completely useless. McIndoe developed techniques for releasing these contractions and rebuilding functional hands using skin grafts and careful positioning. Some patients regained enough dexterity to return to flying, while others learned to perform daily tasks that had seemed impossible. The psychological support system within the Guinea Pig Club was as important as the medical treatment. Long-term patients became mentors to newcomers, sharing coping strategies and maintaining morale during the darkest moments. They developed their own traditions, including annual reunions that continued for decades after the war. The club motto, Per aspera ad astra, through adversity to the stars, reflected their determination to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Guinea Pig Club was how it challenged society's perception of disability and disfigurement. McIndoe encouraged his patients to venture into the local community of East Grinstead, despite their appearance. Initially, local residents were shocked and sometimes frightened by these severely disfigured young men. However, as the community learned their stories and witnessed their courage, attitudes began to change. The townspeople of East Grinstead gradually embraced the Guinea Pig Club members, inviting them to social events, offering friendship, and some even romantic relationships. This social integration was crucial to the patients' psychological recovery. They were learning to navigate the world with their new faces and bodies, building confidence that would serve them long after their medical treatment ended. Yet as the war progressed and new theaters opened, McIndoe and his team would face challenges that went far beyond anything they had encountered in the early days of the Battle of Britain. As World War II expanded into a global conflict, the nature and severity of injuries began to change dramatically. The war in North Africa brought new challenges. Burns from exploding fuel dumps in the desert heat, injuries from chemical warfare agents, and trauma from weapons that had never been used in combat before. The Pacific Theater introduced entirely different problems: flash burns from naval artillery, injuries from flamethrowers, and trauma from weapons specifically designed to cause maximum disfigurement. American forces began encountering burn injuries on a scale that dwarfed anything seen in previous conflicts. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and other heavy bombers carried enormous fuel loads, and when they were hit by anti-aircraft fire, the resulting explosions could burn crew members even through their protective equipment. Bomber crews faced a particularly cruel dilemma. Their aircraft were large enough that they couldn't easily bail out when hit, but sturdy enough that they might survive a crash landing. Many chose to ride their burning aircraft down, sustaining severe burns in the process. The U.S. Army Air Forces established its own plastic surgery units, many staffed by surgeons who had trained with McIndoe or studied his techniques. Dr. Bradford Cannon, working with American bomber crews, found that the scale of reconstruction needed often exceeded anything attempted in civilian practice. Some patients required complete facial reconstruction, new noses, lips, eyelids, and even entirely new ear structures. Naval warfare presented unique challenges that land-based surgeons had never encountered. When ships were hit by enemy fire, burning fuel oil would spread across the water's surface, creating a sea of flames that could burn swimming survivors. These oil fire burns were particularly devastating because the fuel would stick to skin and clothing, continuing to burn even after victims were pulled from the water. Lieutenant Commander Harold Gillies, often considered the father of modern plastic surgery from his work during World War I, found himself dealing with entirely new types of trauma during the Second World War. Gillies had pioneered many basic reconstructive techniques during the earlier conflict, but the weapons of World War II created injuries that required completely new approaches. One of Gillies' most challenging cases involved a Royal Navy officer whose face had been destroyed when his destroyer was hit by a German dive bomber. The explosion had not only burned away most of his facial features, but had also embedded metal fragments throughout his skull. The reconstruction required not just skin grafts, but also the removal of dozens of metal pieces, some located dangerously close to the brain. The case took over 3 years to complete and involved 47 separate operations. Gillies had to rebuild the man's entire face from scratch, creating new eye sockets, reconstructing his jaw, and even building a new nose from scratch using cartilage taken from his ribs. The psychological toll on both patient and surgeon was enormous, but the final result was remarkable: a functioning face that allowed the officer to return to a relatively normal life. However, not all reconstructions were successful. The medical journals of the period, while celebrating the successes, also documented the failures. Patients who underwent dozens of operations only to die from complications, reconstructions that failed catastrophically, and cases where the psychological trauma proved insurmountable despite successful surgery. The failure rate was particularly high for patients with the most severe injuries. Burns covering more than 50% of the body were almost always fatal, despite the best efforts of the surgical teams. Even patients who survived the initial trauma often succumbed to infection, organ failure, or simply the cumulative stress of multiple surgeries. The emotional toll on the surgeons themselves was rarely discussed, but was clearly significant. McIndoe and his colleagues were working 16-hour days, performing complex surgeries with primitive anesthesia and limited equipment. They watched young men die on their operating tables, despite heroic efforts to save them. They performed reconstructions that took years to complete, only to see them fail at the final stage. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of wartime plastic surgery was the knowledge that for every success story, there were dozens of cases that never made it to the operating table. While the Guinea Pig Club and other success stories captured public attention, the reality was that most severely burned servicemen never received the advanced treatment that McIndoe and his colleagues could provide. The logistics of wartime medicine meant that only a small percentage of the most severely injured could be evacuated to specialized facilities. Many died at forward aid stations, lacking the basic medical support needed to survive the initial trauma. The triage decisions made by military medical officers were often heartbreaking. With limited resources and transportation, medics had to choose which patients had the best chance of survival. Severely burned men were often classified as expectant, meaning they were expected to die and would receive only palliative care. These decisions, while medically sound, meant that many who might have benefited from plastic surgery never got the chance. Records from field hospitals reveal the stark reality of wartime burn treatment. A typical report from a Mediterranean theater field hospital in 1943 noted that of 30, Lieutenant Commander Harold Gillies, often considered the father of modern plastic surgery from his work during World War I, found himself dealing with entirely new types of trauma during the Second World War. Gillies had pioneered many basic reconstructive techniques during the earlier conflict, but the weapons of World War II created injuries that required completely new approaches. One of Gillies' most challenging cases involved a Royal Navy officer whose face had been destroyed when his destroyer was hit by a German dive bomber. The explosion had not only burned away most of his facial features, but had also embedded metal fragments throughout his skull. The families of these patients faced their own unique challenges. Many wives and mothers hadn't seen their loved ones since before their injuries, and were unprepared for the extent of their disfigurement. Some relationships couldn't survive the strain. Marriages ended, families were torn apart, and patients found themselves isolated, not just by their injuries, but by the social stigma that still surrounded severe disfigurement. Military records from the period reveal that many patients were discharged from service before their reconstructions were complete, leaving them to seek treatment through civilian medical systems that were often ill-equipped to handle such complex cases. The transition from military to civilian care was frequently catastrophic. Patients lost access to the specialized teams that had been treating them, and found themselves in general hospitals where staff had little experience with reconstructive surgery. The psychological support that had been a cornerstone of McIndoe's approach was often completely absent in civilian facilities. Patients who had been part of the supportive Guinea Pig Club community suddenly found themselves isolated in general wards, surrounded by staff who were uncomfortable with their appearance and unfamiliar with their unique needs. Dr. Jerome Webster, an American plastic surgeon working with veterans in the post-war period, documented case after case of former servicemen who had fallen through the cracks of the medical system. His reports describe patients living as hermits, unable to work or maintain relationships, surviving on minimal disability pensions, while their reconstructions remained incomplete. One of Webster's cases involved a former B-24 bomber pilot who had received initial treatment for severe facial burns, but was discharged before reconstruction could begin. For 3 years after the war, he lived in his parents' basement, refusing to go outside during daylight hours. When Webster finally saw him, his face was so severely contracted by scar tissue that he could barely open his mouth to eat. The reconstruction that followed took 2 years and 17 operations, time and resources that could have been avoided if proper treatment had been available immediately after his injury. The scope of the problem was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 15,000 Allied servicemen survived severe burns during World War II, but fewer than 2,000 received comprehensive reconstructive treatment. The rest lived with their disfigurements, many becoming recluses who withdrew from society entirely. Yet even as these tragic stories multiplied, the war was driving innovations in plastic surgery that would transform the field forever. The extreme nature of wartime injuries forced plastic surgeons to develop techniques that pushed the boundaries of medical possibility. Traditional methods, designed for minor cosmetic corrections or small-scale trauma, were completely inadequate for the massive reconstructions required by war casualties. Surgeons found themselves inventing new procedures during operations, improvising solutions as they encountered problems that had never been seen before. One of the most significant innovations was the development of the walking tube pedicle, a technique that allowed surgeons to move large amounts of healthy skin from one part of the body to another while maintaining blood supply. The process involved creating a tube of skin that remained attached at both ends, then gradually walking it across the body over a period of weeks or months until it reached its final destination. The technique sounds almost medieval in its approach, but it was revolutionary in its results. A patient might have a tube of skin from his abdomen gradually moved up his chest, across his shoulder, and eventually to his face, where it would be used to reconstruct a nose or rebuild damaged lips. The process required incredible patience from both surgeon and patient. Each movement of the tube required a separate operation, and the entire process could take 6 months or more. Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Page underwent one of the most complex walking tube pedicle reconstructions of the war. His hands had been so severely burned that surgeons initially recommended amputation. Instead, McIndoe decided to attempt a reconstruction that had never been tried before. Using skin from Page's chest, a tube pedicle was created and slowly walked down his arm to his hand. The process took 8 months and 12 operations, but the result was a functional hand that allowed Page to return to flying. Facial reconstruction techniques evolved rapidly during the war years. Early attempts at nose reconstruction often resulted in crude, non-functional appendages that looked artificial and couldn't breathe properly. By 1944, surgeons had developed methods for creating noses with proper internal structure, including functional nasal passages and even the ability to smell. The reconstruction of eyelids presented particular challenges because these structures are not simply skin flaps. They must be precisely positioned to protect the eye while allowing normal vision and blinking. Surgeons developed techniques for creating new eyelids using skin grafts combined with cartilage supports, often taken from the patient's ears. The procedures were delicate and time-consuming, but they could restore both function and appearance to eyes that had been permanently damaged. Dr. Varazted Kazanjian, an Armenian-American surgeon working with Allied forces, pioneered several techniques for jaw reconstruction that are still used today. His patients often arrived with massive injuries from anti-aircraft fire or bomb explosions that had destroyed not just soft tissue, but also the underlying bone structure. Kazanjian developed methods for rebuilding entire sections of the jaw using bone grafts taken from other parts of the patient's skeleton. One of Kazanjian's most remarkable cases involved a tank commander whose jaw had been completely destroyed by a German anti-tank round. The explosion had taken away not just his jaw, but also most of his tongue and throat. The reconstruction required bone grafts from his hip, cartilage from his ribs, and skin grafts from multiple sites. The process took over 2 years, but the final result allowed the patient to eat solid food and speak clearly, outcomes that would have been impossible with the techniques available at the beginning of the war. Anesthesia techniques also evolved rapidly during this period. Early reconstructive surgeries were performed with primitive anesthetics that provided inadequate pain control and posed significant risks to patients who were already weakened by their injuries. By 1943, anesthesiologists had developed new drug combinations and delivery methods that allowed for longer, more complex operations while minimizing risks to the patient. The development of antibiotic therapy during the war years was crucial to the success of reconstructive surgery. Before penicillin became widely available, infection was a constant threat that could destroy months of surgical work in a matter of days. The introduction of effective antibiotic treatment dramatically improved survival rates and allowed surgeons to attempt more ambitious reconstructions. However, perhaps the most important innovation was the recognition that plastic surgery needed to address not just physical reconstruction, but psychological rehabilitation as well. The psychological aspects of severe disfigurement were perhaps the most challenging element of wartime plastic surgery, yet they received the least attention from the medical establishment. Traditional military medicine focused on getting wounded soldiers back into combat as quickly as possible, but severe facial injuries created problems that couldn't be solved simply by repairing tissue damage. Patients with severe facial burns often experienced what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the 1940s, psychological trauma was poorly understood and often dismissed as weakness or malingering. The combination of combat stress and severe disfigurement created a perfect storm of mental health challenges that few medical professionals were equipped to handle. Squadron leader Richard Hillary, one of McIndoe's most famous patients, wrote extensively about the psychological aspects of his recovery. His memoir described the horror of seeing his burned face for the first time, the depression that followed months of painful surgery, and the struggle to rebuild not just his physical appearance but his entire sense of identity. Hillary's case illustrated the complex relationship between physical appearance and psychological well-being. Even after successful reconstruction, many patients struggled with self-image issues that persisted long after their physical healing was complete. They had lost not just their original faces, but their confidence, their social connections, and often their sense of purpose. The social stigma surrounding facial disfigurement in the 1940s was enormous. People with visible disabilities were often excluded from public spaces, employment opportunities, and social activities. Many patients found that even successful surgical reconstruction couldn't fully restore their place in society. The subtle reactions of others, the stares and whispers, served as constant reminders of their injuries. McIndoe recognized that traditional medical approaches were inadequate for addressing these psychological challenges. His decision to encourage patients to interact with the local community wasn't just about physical rehabilitation. It was a form of exposure therapy that helped patients build confidence in social situations while gradually changing public attitudes toward disfigurement. The Guinea Pig Club served as a crucial support network for patients struggling with psychological trauma. Long-term patients became informal counselors for newcomers, sharing coping strategies and providing encouragement during the darkest periods of recovery. The club's social activities, drinking sessions, parties, and romantic relationships helped normalize the experience of living with disfigurement. However, not all patients were able to benefit from this support system. Some withdrew completely, becoming increasingly isolated as their treatment progressed. Military records document cases of patients who refused to continue with reconstruction, preferring to live with their disfigurements rather than endure additional surgery and social exposure. The failure rate for psychological recovery was actually higher than the failure rate for surgical reconstruction. Many patients who underwent successful physical reconstruction never fully recovered psychologically. They remained depressed, anxious, and socially isolated, despite having faces that appeared relatively normal to outside observers. Dr. John Converse, an American plastic surgeon who worked extensively with World War II veterans, documented the long-term psychological outcomes for his patients. His follow-up studies, conducted 5 and 10 years after the war, revealed that many veterans continued to struggle with depression, anxiety, and social isolation decades after their physical healing was complete. One of Converse's patients, a former P-51 pilot who had undergone extensive facial reconstruction, described his ongoing psychological challenges decades after the war. Despite having a face that appeared normal to casual observers, he reported persistent anxiety in social situations, difficulty maintaining relationships, and recurring nightmares about his crash. The physical reconstruction had been successful, but the psychological wounds remained largely untreated. The wives and families of disfigured veterans faced their own psychological challenges that were rarely acknowledged by the medical system. Many struggled with guilt, grief, and their own forms of post-traumatic stress as they watched their loved ones endure years of painful surgery and psychological trauma. Yet despite these challenges, some patients achieved remarkable psychological recovery, often becoming advocates for others facing similar struggles. The impact of World War II plastic surgery extended far beyond the patients themselves, creating ripple effects that transformed medicine, society, and our understanding of human resilience. The techniques developed under wartime pressure would eventually revolutionize civilian medicine, but the immediate post-war period revealed just how unprepared society was to integrate severely disfigured veterans back into normal life. The end of the war brought a new set of challenges for patients who had undergone reconstruction. Many had spent years in military hospitals, surrounded by others who shared similar experiences and understood their struggles. Suddenly, they were discharged into civilian society that had little understanding of what they had endured and limited resources to support their ongoing needs. Employment discrimination was a major problem for disfigured veterans. Despite legal protections and public rhetoric about supporting returning servicemen, many employers were reluctant to hire workers with visible disabilities. The reasoning was often practical. Customers might be uncomfortable, or the worker might not be able to perform certain tasks. But the result was that many highly skilled veterans found themselves unemployable. Some veterans found creative solutions to these challenges. Several former Guinea Pig Club members went into business together, creating companies where their appearance wouldn't affect their ability to work. Others found employment in industries where technical skills mattered more than appearance, such as engineering or manufacturing. The psychological support systems that had been so crucial during treatment often disappeared after discharge. The camaraderie of the hospital ward was replaced by isolation in civilian communities that didn't understand their experiences. Many veterans struggled with the transition, and some never successfully integrated back into society. However, the wartime advances in plastic surgery were beginning to transform civilian medicine in ways that would benefit thousands of people who had never seen combat. Techniques developed for treating severe burns were adapted for use with civilian burn victims, dramatically improving survival rates and functional outcomes for people injured in industrial accidents, house fires, and automobile crashes. The walking tube pedicle technique, pioneered for military reconstructions, found applications in treating birth defects, cancer patients who required extensive tissue removal, and victims of civilian trauma. Procedures that had been developed out of desperation in military hospitals became standard treatments in civilian practice. Medical schools began incorporating plastic surgery into their curricula, recognizing it as a legitimate specialty rather than a cosmetic luxury. The dramatic success stories from the war had demonstrated that reconstructive surgery could restore not just appearance, but function and quality of life. Young doctors who had witnessed the wartime innovations were eager to continue developing the field. The social attitudes toward disfigurement began to change gradually, partly due to the visibility of wounded veterans in post-war society. Communities that had learned to accept and support disfigured servicemen during the war found it easier to extend that acceptance to civilian patients with similar conditions. Dr. McIndoe continued his work after the war, establishing the first comprehensive burn treatment center at East Grinstead and training a new generation of plastic surgeons. His post-war patients included civilians who had been burned in industrial accidents, children born with severe birth defects, and cancer patients requiring reconstruction after tumor removal. The Guinea Pig Club continued to meet regularly for decades after the war, providing ongoing support for its members and raising funds for burn research. The club's annual reunions became legendary events where former patients would share stories, compare their ongoing recovery, and remember those who hadn't survived their injuries. Many club members went on to have successful careers and families, defying the predictions that their injuries would prevent them from living normal lives. Their success stories helped change public perceptions about disability and disfigurement, demonstrating that severe injuries didn't necessarily mean the end of a productive life. The research conducted during the war years laid the foundation for modern burn treatment and reconstructive surgery. Techniques for skin grafting, wound management, and infection control that were developed under wartime pressure became standard practice in civilian hospitals around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy of wartime plastic surgery was the recognition that medical treatment needed to address the whole person, not just the injured body part. The innovations developed during World War II fundamentally changed not just plastic surgery, but the entire approach to treating severe trauma. The holistic methods pioneered by McIndoe and his colleagues, treating patients as complete human beings rather than collections of medical problems, became the foundation for modern rehabilitation medicine. The concept of the multidisciplinary treatment team, now standard in major medical centers, emerged directly from the wartime experience. McIndoe had recognized that successful reconstruction required not just surgical skill, but also expertise in anesthesia, nursing, psychology, physical therapy, and social work. This team approach produced better outcomes than any individual practitioner could achieve alone. Post-war research revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished during the conflict. Statistical analysis showed that patients treated using the new techniques had survival rates that were dramatically higher than those treated with traditional methods. More importantly, the functional outcomes, the ability to eat, speak, see, and perform daily activities, were far superior to anything that had been achieved before the war. The psychological insights gained during the war years influenced the development of what would eventually become post-traumatic stress disorder treatment. The recognition that physical trauma and psychological trauma were interconnected led to new approaches for treating both military and civilian patients who had experienced severe injuries. Dr. Archibald McIndoe was knighted in 1947 for his contributions to medicine and his service to wounded servicemen. The citation specifically noted not just his surgical innovations, but his revolutionary approach to treating patients as complete human beings, rather than medical cases. This recognition helped establish the legitimacy of comprehensive rehabilitation as a medical specialty. The techniques developed during the war continued to evolve in the post-war period. Surgeons who had learned their craft treating combat casualties applied their skills to civilian problems, developing new approaches for treating birth defects, cancer patients, and accident victims. The field of reconstructive surgery expanded rapidly, with new subspecialties emerging to address specific types of problems. Burn treatment centers, modeled on the facility at East Grinstead, were established in major cities around the world. These centers combined the latest surgical techniques with comprehensive rehabilitation services, providing burn victims with the kind of coordinated care that had been pioneered during the war. The development of new materials and technologies accelerated the evolution of reconstructive surgery. Synthetic materials that could replace damaged tissue, improved anesthetics that allowed for longer operations, and better understanding of wound healing all contributed to better outcomes for patients. Medical education was transformed by the wartime experience. The dramatic success stories from military hospitals demonstrated the importance of reconstructive surgery, leading to its inclusion in standard medical curricula. Young doctors who might never have considered specializing in plastic surgery were inspired by the wartime innovations to pursue careers in the field. The social changes initiated during the war continued to evolve in the post-war period. Communities that had learned to accept and support disfigured veterans gradually extended that acceptance to all people with disabilities. This shift in attitudes contributed to the eventual passage of disability rights legislation and the development of support services for people with disabilities. However, the human cost of these innovations was never forgotten. The patients who had undergone experimental procedures during the war years had paid a heavy price for the knowledge that would benefit future generations. Many had endured dozens of operations, years of pain, and lifelong disabilities in order to pioneer techniques that would eventually become routine. The Guinea Pig Club continued to serve as a reminder of both the human cost of war and the potential for medical innovation to transform lives. The club's motto, Per aspera ad astra, captured the essence of their experience. Through great hardship, they had reached for the stars and achieved what had once seemed impossible. As the decades passed, the wartime innovations continued to evolve and improve. Techniques that had been crude and experimental in the 1940s were refined and perfected, producing results that the original pioneers could hardly have imagined. But the fundamental principles established during the war years, treating the whole person, combining multiple disciplines, and never giving up hope, remained at the heart of reconstructive surgery. The story of World War II plastic surgery is ultimately a testament to human resilience and the power of medical innovation to transform tragedy into hope. The young men who fell from burning aircraft and survived tank explosions became the unlikely pioneers of a medical revolution that continues to benefit patients around the world today. The statistical achievements of wartime plastic surgery are impressive. Thousands of lives saved, functional ability restored to men who had been written off as hopeless cases, and techniques developed that revolutionized medicine. But the true measure of success lies in the individual stories of men who rebuilt not just their faces, but their lives. Richard Hillary, despite his extensive injuries and psychological struggles, returned to flying and wrote one of the most influential memoirs of the war. His book, The Last Enemy, helped the public understand both the human cost of modern warfare and the potential for recovery from seemingly impossible injuries. Jeffrey Page, whose hand reconstruction had taken 8 months and 12 operations, not only returned to flying, but became a successful businessman and author. His post-war career demonstrated that severe injuries didn't necessarily mean the end of a productive life. Tom Gleave, whose face had been so severely burned that McIndoe could barely determine where his features had been, eventually recovered enough to return to active duty. More importantly, he became an advocate for other burn victims, helping to establish support networks that continued long after the war ended. The Guinea Pig Club continued to meet for decades after the war, with members supporting each other through ongoing medical challenges and life transitions. The last official meeting was held in 2007, more than 60 years after the war's end. By then, most of the original members had passed away, but their legacy lived on in the medical techniques they had helped pioneer and the social attitudes they had helped change. The impact of their sacrifice extends far beyond the battlefield. Modern burn treatment centers around the world still use techniques that were first developed in the makeshift hospitals of wartime Britain. Thousands of civilian patients, victims of house fires, industrial accidents, and automobile crashes, have benefited from procedures that were pioneered by RAF pilots with burned faces. The psychological approaches developed during the war years influenced the entire field of rehabilitation medicine. The recognition that successful treatment required addressing both physical and emotional trauma became a cornerstone of modern medical practice. Today's trauma centers routinely include psychologists, social workers, and peer counselors as part of their treatment teams, an approach that can be traced directly back to McIndoe's revolutionary methods at East Grinstead. Perhaps most importantly, the wartime experience changed society's understanding of disability and disfigurement. The courage displayed by the Guinea Pig Club members and other wounded veterans helped break down barriers that had existed for centuries. Their willingness to venture into public despite their disfigurements, to pursue careers and relationships, and to live full lives challenged preconceptions about what it meant to be disabled. The medical innovations born from the tragedy of war continue to evolve. Modern plastic surgeons can achieve reconstructions that would have seemed miraculous to McIndoe and his colleagues. Face transplants, once the realm of science fiction, are now reality. Stem cell therapy and tissue engineering promise even more dramatic advances in the years to come. But the fundamental lesson of wartime plastic surgery remains unchanged, that human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to adapt, overcome, and rebuild in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The young men who stared into mirrors and saw strangers looking back at them chose not to surrender to despair, but to fight for their futures. Their courage, combined with the dedication of pioneering surgeons, transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would follow in their footsteps. The burns have healed, the scars have faded, and most of the original patients have passed away. But their legacy lives on in every burn center, every reconstructive surgery, and every patient who refuses to let devastating injuries define the limits of their life. They prove that even in the darkest hours of human conflict, hope and healing could emerge from tragedy. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.